Morning. I call this hearing to order. I thank everybody for joining us today, both virtually and in the hearing room. I'd also like to thank the witnesses for their participation in this important and timely oversight hearing. Before we begin, I'd like to take this opportunity to note some important requirements. Let me begin by saying that standing House and committee rules and practice will continue to apply during hybrid proceedings. All members are reminded that they're expected to adhere to these standing rules, including decorum. During the covered period as designated by the Speaker, the committee will operate in accordance with House Resolution 965 and the subsequent guidance from the Rules Committee in a manner that respects the rights of all members to participate. House regulations require members to be visible through a video connection throughout the proceeding, so please keep your cameras on. Also, please remember to remain muted until you are recognized to minimize background noise. If you must participate in another proceeding, please exit this one and log back in later. In the event a member encounters technical issues that prevent them from being recognized for their questioning, I will move to the next available member of the same party, and I will recognize that member at the appropriate time slot, provided they have returned to the proceedings. For those members physically present in the committee room today, we'll also be following the health and safety guidelines issued by the attending physician. This includes social distancing and especially the use of masks. I urge members and staff to wear masks at all times while in the hearing room. I thank you in advance for your commitment to a safe environment for all here today. The COVID-19 pandemic has fundamentally altered the way small businesses operate. Mandatory closures to protect public health have significantly impacted their bottom line and visibility. To help small businesses weather the pandemic, Congress has passed a series of legislative packages. On March 6th, the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriations Act became law and authorized SBA's Disaster Assistance Program to use available funds to issue Economic Injury Disaster Loans, or EIDL, to small businesses affected by the pandemic. On March 27th, the CARES Act was signed into law and created the Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP, and the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Emergency Advance. And SBA acted extremely quickly to implement these critical economic relief programs in order to deliver emergency funding to small business owners to keep them afloat. Over the past 6 months, more than 5.2 million PPP loans and approximately 3.5 million EIDL applications have been approved. That's an incredible amount of federal assistance to America's small businesses, and I commend SBA staff for creating the infrastructure to set up these programs so quickly. SBA was asked to undertake an enormously challenging task to implementing these programs in just a few days, and this committee recognizes that some mistakes were expected. But the Congress and the American people must have confidence that the administration is taking seriously their responsibility to mitigate fraud and ensure that this assistance is available to all eligible small businesses. Today, I hope to learn more from the SBA Inspector General and the Government Accountability Office about your findings and discuss ways to improve the delivery of SBA services to small businesses. On July 28th, the SBA Office of Inspector General released a report detailing potential incidents of fraud in the EIDL program. Initial investigations found tens of millions of dollars in duplicate loans and serious concerns about suspected fraud, including instances of accounts established with stolen identities and attempted award transfers to foreign accounts and deposits into personal accounts that have no evidence of business activity. And without swift action from SBA, these fraudulent activities will only become more widespread as Congress debates legislation to allocate more emergency assistance as the economic impact of the pandemic stretches on. I understand that SBA responded to this report by stating they have internal controls in place to address these types of fraud. Yet, recent reporting from the Project on Government Oversight, or POGO, casts doubt on how effective these internal controls are. The POGO report stated that anti-fraud policies were not fully implemented during EIDL processing. Software was not up to date, and that SBA was struggling in mid-August to handle fraudulent applications. As a chairwoman of the Investigations, Oversight, and Regulation Subcommittee, I'm concerned with these reports and hope we can have a constructive discussion to address these findings today. In addition to the IG's report, the GAO released reports on August 31st and September 21st detailing concerns with SBA's oversight of the PPP and their ability to collect and interpret applicant data. The September report outlines extremely concerning gaps in the availability of demographic information and serious data reliability issues. The report also details potential fraud that the SBA referred to both the IG and the Department of Justice. More than 40 fraud-related cases are currently under investigation. Additionally, the report finds that SBA has failed to adequately prepare borrowers and lenders for the PPP forgiveness process. Demonstrating the seriousness of this problem, last week SBA announced that they had received 96,000 forgiveness applications, representing less than 2% of the loans that were dispersed, but they still have not processed a single one. Perhaps most troubling to me are reports that GAO has had difficulty even completing their audit objectives because SBA has not been forthcoming with documentation and access to data. Today, I'd like to learn more about where SBA stands in implementing internal fraud controls, where the deficiencies lie, and what this subcommittee can do to support SBA in their efforts to prevent fraud in both EIDL and PPP. Again, I want to thank the witnesses for participating both virtually and in person, and I now yield to the ranking member, Mr. Spano, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you, Chair Velasquez, for holding today's timely hearing. To combat the economic impact of the coronavirus pandemic, this committee has worked to create and optimize economic relief programs administered by the SBA. Through bipartisan cooperation and interagency negotiations, we created the Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP. We revitalized the Pre-Existing Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, EIDL. I'd like to take a moment to thank everyone for their work. Both programs have been a lifeline for our nation's small businesses. As of August the 8th, 2020, the date that the program reached its authorized deadline, the SBA had approved over 5.2 million loans totaling more than $525 billion. The average loan size was around $100,000, and there were nearly 5,500 participating lenders. Florida small businesses received nearly 432,000 PPP loans for a total of more than $32 billion. And in my district, Florida's 15th district, 10,254 businesses have received $304 million loans in PPP funds. These loans have helped small business owners keep the lights on and keep their employees on the payroll. I've talked with many small business owners since the launch of the PPP, like Tom Powell, owner of Boulder Athletic Wear in Plant City, Florida, a manufacturer of women's athletic wear in my district. The loan was absolutely essential and crucial for Mr. Powell's business because it provided the critical capital necessary to retain his employees through the retail closures. In addition to creating the new PPP program, the CARES Act and its subsequent legislation expanded the pre-existing EIDL program administered by the SBA's Disaster Loan Program. And as of September the 13th, 2020, the SBA has approved 3.5 million EIDL loans for approximately $190 billion with an average loan size of $53,000. The EIDL Advance Grant, which is not required to be paid back, provided 6 million small businesses with $20 billion in grants. Florida small businesses had approximately 450,000 EIDL loans approved for nearly $20 billion. With only the basic statistics, Congress cannot fully measure the impact of these programs, that's for sure. We need to ensure that loans went to the intended businesses and that the loan proceeds were used properly. Fortunately, we have fantastic allies in the SBA's Office of Inspector General and the Government Accountability Office. Today, each office has sent a representative, and we're grateful for that, to represent their initial, or to present, I should say, their initial reviews of PPP and EIDL. We look forward to working together to make sure that taxpayer dollars are spent appropriately and to reduce waste, fraud, and abuse in these critical SBA relief programs. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Spano. The gentleman yields back. And if other subcommittee members have an opening statement, we would ask that they be submitted for the record. I would like to just take a moment to explain how this hearing will proceed. Each witness will have 5 minutes to testify, and each member will have 5 minutes for questions. Please ensure that your microphone is on when you begin speaking and that you return to mute when finished. I would now like to introduce our witnesses. Our first witness is the Honorable Hannibal Mike Ware, Inspector General of the SBA. Mr. Ware was sworn in as the Inspector General in May 2018 and has been an effective leader in his role and an asset to this committee. He has 28 years of experience in the IG community, rooting out fraud, waste, and abuse in federal programs. He's received numerous awards throughout his career, including several awards from the Council of the Inspectors General on integrity and efficiency in recognition for a significant portfolio of oversight work. Welcome, Mr. Ware.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our second witness is Mr. William Shear, Director of Financial Markets and Community Investment Team at the Government Accountability Office. He leads GAO's Work, Community, and Economic Development, Small Business, and SBA's COVID-19 response programs. Mr. Shear joined GAO more than 20 years ago. He has a master's degree in public policy and a PhD in economics, both from the University of Chicago. He also served as an adjunct faculty member in the graduate program in city and regional planning in the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome, Mr. Shear. I'd like to begin today's hearing by recognizing Mr. Ware for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Chu, ranking members panel, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to speak with you today and for your continued support of my office. Believe me when I say that. The men and women of the Office of Inspector General have been working diligently to provide oversight of SBA's pandemic response. I am always proud to represent them publicly and to speak to you about our important work. I come before you today in the wake of a historic crisis posed by the COVID-19 pandemic and an ensuing unprecedented role for SBA to mitigate the damages to the nation's economic vitality. SBA is managing over $1 trillion in lending authority through PPP and the EIDL program. The speed and lowered guardrails relative to eligibility verification controls surrounding the PPP and the EIDL lending authorities brought with it substantially increased risk. As indicated in my written statement, we sought to inform SBA's efforts through 3 white paper reports offering lessons learned and known risks to implementing PPP and EIDL based on prior oversight of the Recovery Act and other disasters. At the same time, we focused on preventing and deterring fraud by raising public awareness of fraud schemes and scams. At the outset, we initiated several reviews to include the PPP and EIDL reviews. During the course of these reviews, we had alarming findings, causing us to issue a flash report on PPP in May and a management alert on EIDL in July. As oversight work carried on, we solidified our preliminary results and identified additional findings. On September 14th, we provided SBA leadership 2 draft reports, one containing our findings related to SBA's implementation of PPP, and one containing findings of SBA's initial disaster assistance response to COVID-19. Our review standards require that we consider SBA's official comments prior to issuing these reports in final. We anticipate publishing these reports in mid-October, following the 30-day review and comment period by SBA's leaders. As such, my comments today regarding those findings must be considered preliminary, so we can account for SBA's official comments before finalizing our reports. Nonetheless, Our findings are significant and speak to the need for strengthening internal controls and for combating potential fraud in the programs. Our reports speak to significant potential fraud in both PPP and EIDL. It is remarked as potential only because we have not reviewed each loan associated with the area of finding. However, the amount of dollars we cite as being subject to potential fraud are not based on projections. Rather, they are based on buckets of loans meeting criteria for a weak internal control environment, where in many instances we have active criminal investigations of fraud to substantiate the concern. Our office has received tens of thousands of complaints of wrongdoing on our hotline. Hundreds of investigations involving complaints of fraud have been initiated by my office and are ongoing, with noteworthy results being reported daily by the United States Department of Justice, which has been a tremendous partner. Among these accomplishments was the first in the nation charges against individuals fraudulently seeking PPP loans, which was announced on May 5th. More than 57 defendants have been charged with PPP fraud since the CARES Act passage, as announced by the Department of Justice on September 10th. I want to assure SBA's lending partners and the nation's small business owners that if they follow the guidelines and acted in good faith, we are not focused on your actions. The findings we report do not diminish the feat that the men and women of SBA and their lending partners accomplished. At one point in the crisis, it was reported that SBA performed as 14 years worth of lending in just 14 days. However, our oversight work confirms SBA did not have sufficient controls to address risks and provide assurance that PPP loans and EIDL grants and loans were only being received by eligible recipients. We will continue our efforts to keep the administrator and this Congress currently and fully informed of our findings. We are not alone in this effort. Programs of this magnitude require a whole of government response. As a statutory member of the Council of the Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency's Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, I am working with my Inspector General colleagues to leverage the collective power of joint oversight efforts to increase transparency of SBA's pandemic response. Rest assured, the men and women of my office understand that nothing short of the public's trust is at stake, as well as the vitality of the nation's economy. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I am happy to answer any questions you may have of me.
Thank you, Mr. Ware. Mr. Scheer, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here this morning to discuss our work on SBA's Paycheck Protection Program and Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. Through these programs, SBA has made or guaranteed more than 14.5 million loans and grants, providing about $729 billion to help small businesses adversely affected by COVID-19. In April 2020, SBA moved quickly to implement PPP. Given the immediate need for these loans, SBA worked to streamline the program so that lenders could begin distributing these funds as soon as possible. For example, lenders were permitted to rely on borrowers' self-certifications for eligibility and use of loan proceeds. As a result, there was significant risk that some fraudulent or inflated applications were approved. In our June report, we recommended that SBA develop and implement plans to identify and respond to risk in PPP to ensure program integrity, achieve program effectiveness, and address potential fraud. According to federal internal control standards and GAO's fraud risk framework, managers and executive branch agencies are responsible for managing fraud risk and implementing practices for mitigating those risks. When fraud risk can be identified and mitigated, fraud may be less likely to occur. In June 2020, we reported that reliance on applicants' self-certifications can leave a program vulnerable to exploitation by those who wish to circumvent eligibility requirements or pursue criminal activity. Since May 2020, the Department of Justice has publicly announced charges in more than 50 fraud-related cases associated with PPP funds. In April 2020, SBA announced it would review all loans of more than $2 million to confirm borrower eligibility, and SBA officials subsequently stated that they would review selected loans of less than $2 million to determine, for example, whether the borrower is entitled to loan forgiveness. However, SBA did not provide details on how it would conduct either of these reviews. As of September 2020, SBA reported that it was working with the Department of the Treasury and contractors to finalize the plans for the reviews. Because SBA had limited time to implement safeguards up front for loan approval, we believe that planning and oversight by SBA to address risk in a PPP program is crucial moving forward. We continue to be concerned about the potential for fraud in PPP and are continuing to conduct work on the program, including on internal controls and fraud risk management. SBA's efforts to expedite processing of economic injury disaster loans, such as the reliance on self-certification, may have contributed to increased fraud risk in that program as well. In July 2020, as Mike Ware just stated, SBA's Office of Inspector General reported indicators of widespread potential fraud, including thousands of fraud complaints, and found deficiencies with SBA's internal controls. The Department of Justice, in conjunction with other federal agencies, has also taken actions to address potential fraud. We continue to be concerned about the potential for fraud in the EIDL program and are currently conducting work on the program, including on internal controls and fraud risk management. However, we have experienced delay in obtaining data and information requested from SBA, including access to application-level EIDL data. We continue to take actions to obtain records needed to move forward with our work. Chairwoman Chu, Ranking Member Spano, and members of the subcommittee, this concludes my statement. I would be pleased to respond to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Scheer. We will begin the questioning, and I will begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Well, frankly, I am shocked by these findings. Our two main loan and grant programs are EIDL and PPP, and in both programs, you have said that there are not the internal controls in existence to prevent fraud. So I have many questions. First, I'd like to start with Mike Ware, our Inspector General. And just to summarize, you said that there was fraud and also that there was a lack of internal controls, so that for number one, there were $250 million worth of loans in the EIDL program, loans and grants in the EIDL program that were given despite the fact that they were clearly ineligible. That is, no business was eligible if they created their business after January 1st of this year. And yet, loans were given in the amount of $250 million and grants to these particular businesses. The second problem, the duplicate loans. I mean, there were no internal controls, and as a result, duplicate loans in the amount of $45.6 million were approved. And then third is the shocking social media fraud schemes in which they use social media to recruit applicants and then split the advance money with the ringleaders. And in fact, there was advertising of their ability to secure SBA money for clients to start businesses, and then the sharing of this money. I'm just astounded that these terrible acts took place when legitimate, deserving businesses could have used that help. So, Inspector General Ware, in your report, you stated that despite the internal controls that SBA has claimed are in place, fraud and the potential for fraud still exist in the economic injury disaster loan or the EIDL program. Can you identify the weak points in SBA's internal controls, and how can SBA improve these existing controls in the time ahead?
I certainly can and have identified those to SBA's leadership. So the challenge that SBA always has, especially in their disaster lending program, is they have to balance. Balance is a key word here. The need of speeding aid to people in desperate need while balancing against a proper control environment. In this instance, SBA's efforts to hurry capital to businesses were at the expense of controls that would have mitigated the risks of ineligible or fraudulent businesses obtaining PPP or EIDL loans. And that's why we have the problems that we have. The SBA said for themselves that to get funds to eligible entities quickly, they lowered the guardrails for the EIDL program in specific by removing or weakening of controls. And we have found for a fact through thousands of contacts from banks, tens of thousands of hotline complaints, and our own data analytics, that those actions increased fraud risk significantly. Now, again, they have that balance to deal with, but the balance cannot, one part of the balancing act cannot be sacrificed for the other. And the type of things that we were finding in terms of controls lower, of course, the self-certification part was one, but the contractor that they got with had some built-in controls. But these things, the loan applications came in huge batches. So that batch process and the speed to get it out allowed a lot of things to be missed. And then there were a lot of things, other controls that were not in place, such as what happens after the contractor says, okay, this is a legitimate bank account. But they allowed on the back end the applicant to change the bank account before the money was disbursed, and there was no control in place to at least double check or make sure that those were going to an eligible recipient. Now, the agency in these meetings, especially on EIDL, they have taken a lot of action already. And before the alert went out, we had been meeting with them because we thought it was critical that they knew this information, that they take action immediately. So they shored up the control where it re-verifies the bank account information every time it's changed. And if they didn't find issues with the loan application or only minor issues, then they would come to SBA in much smaller batches. And then they now have a team lead approving the batches. And I mean, they've done that. Let me see what else. They've done quite a bit. They found a logic issue with the system of control that they said they had in place, where it wasn't identifying all the duplicative information. And now they have addressed that issue. And now the big thing that they've put in place is that they have began automatically declining loan applications where the system identifies suspicious online activity. That wasn't happening at all. For example, related applications by the same bank accounts that are not the same person. Email addresses or phone numbers in somebody else's name. Weird email addresses with like odd period location, like mi.ke.wa.re, for example, along with the regular mike.where. Now that may force any legitimate applicants into the loan application reconsideration process to allow for support and documentation before the applicant gets their loan approval. And yeah, so they have pivoted pretty quickly on implementing the controls. I have to say, I don't know if the time is up or not, but fraudsters are going to do what fraudsters are going to do. And we have to continue to meet with the agency when we find new schemes so that they can pivot quickly to mitigate a lot of the risks and to shore up their controls. And I think that they have been pretty responsive to that.
Well, thank you for that thorough answer. And now we have our ranking member, Mr. Spano from Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The CARES Act set up an intricate web of oversight mechanisms utilizing pre-existing offices and creating new ones like the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee and the Office of the Special Inspector General for Pandemic Recovery. My question is, how do your offices contribute to the larger pandemic oversight system? If you could answer that first, Mr. Scheer.
We have a major responsibility in the CARES Act, and it was actually articulated to each of the affected agencies from letters from the Comptroller General. as far as our role in overseeing CARES Act programs broadly, and the need for us to report on generally a bi-monthly basis to the Congress on a wide variety of issues. So in contrast, I just say that we focus on issues just as my colleague Mike Ware does, dealing with fraud risk and things of that nature, but we deal with broader issues having to do with the integrity of the programs. So we do look at responsiveness. We have issued reports in June, August, and September that deal with the wide range of CARES Act programs and addressing them in a broad way and doing detailed audit work.
Yeah. Mr. Ware, would you like to briefly
Sure.
respond to that?
So, yeah, I will. And this is actually like one of the questions that I was hoping that I would get, mainly because of the prominent role that I play on the PRAC. I am the audit committee chair on the PRAC, and we meet regularly, like every single week. I'm a statutory member of that committee. So in our meetings, we work constantly to determine how we can help the community and how we could move the whole of government approach forward. If you've noticed the press releases concerning our investigative work, it is always joint. We've been working with the FBI, FDIC, Federal Reserve Board, HHS. I mean, this has been an all hands on deck approach to this oversight, because no single one of our offices could handle this alone due to the magnitude of issues that we are finding. Regarding Mr. Miller's new shop, he's just standing that up, and him and I have had several one-on-one meetings, particularly to pass on certain things to my office that he is not able to do at this time as he stands up his office. But we are all in communication and all working in a collaborative manner to ensure that the proper level of oversight is undertaken.
Do you feel like you need any additional guidance or clarity in terms of the roles that you're playing respectively?
Sir, I do not. I believe that the act that stood up, the PRAC, as we refer to it as, was pretty clear. Okay. I do believe that, well, you know what, in some meetings we've discussed quicker access to data for the PRAC. But I'm pretty sure that's something that the executive director
Mr. Scheer, would you like to respond to that?
I think that the CARES Act, beyond just relying on our access authority in our role generally as Congress's watchdog, that there was very clear that we had very expansive authority, we had very expansive responsibilities, and we, led by our Comptroller General, Gene Dodaro, have gone on in that direction. We generally have had very good cooperation with the agencies that are included. So it's an expansive role, and it very clearly states what our role is and what our authorities are in terms of access to information.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired, and the gentleman yields back. Now the gentle lady from New York, our chairwoman, Nydia Velasquez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Chu and Mr. Spano, Ranking Member. This is a very important oversight responsibility that we have in this committee regarding the CARES Act. So, Mr. Scheer, we understand that you had issues and problems accessing idle data from SBA. Why do you think that happened?
We and I always try to avoid trying to say what's going through people's mind, But what we can observe is a situation that is not a cooperative one, which we have experienced. We have experienced a more cooperative environment with SBA dealing with other matters, but not when it comes to CARES Act. As you know, that with PPP data.
Would you, excuse me, sir,
sure.
would you characterize the actions out of the SBA as obstructionist?
There was obstruction when we were trying to obtain loan-level PPP data. That went on for weeks. Getting access to people to talk about how they were implementing PPP, that went on for weeks. We still aren't getting a lot of cooperation from SBA, and yet they accuse us of not giving them credit for what oversight they have in place when they provide very little information and don't respond to what we're asking. With EIDL, it is more extreme. We have asked a very long time ago for application-level EIDL data.
So let me ask you, it is clear that you have expanded authority, and the Comptroller General has expanded authority to demand and to have the access to the information, to have access to the data. And so I myself have to call the administrator to ask her to expedite or to allow for the Comptroller General to have the information that he was requesting. He personally called me, and I believe that even called the ranking member. Can you imagine? It is our responsibility to protect taxpayers' money and to make sure that the program is implemented. And what we have seen is not only a case of fraud and abuse committed in the EIDL and both the PPP, but mismanagement. Probably the obstruction coming out of the SBA is because they knew that they didn't take or implement the kind of controls to prevent fraud and abuse. So what can we do? What can Congress can do to help you do your job going forward?
As you and
Do you think that, for example, with withholding agency funding, that will be an option?
it's like it could be an option, and I would hope it wouldn't come down to that. But if you go back to the issues that we had with just getting loan-level PPP data, I'm sure you and Ranking Member Shabbat and other members of Congress were surprised when Gene Dodaro, the Comptroller General, was making personal calls to you, seeking your support, and we appreciate it greatly. It's unfortunate it was necessary. With EIDL, and some of this, it's not just data that we know should be readily available, but there's certain things like contracts. There's a tremendous delegation of authority to contractors where we're just asking for contracts, that very straightforward information to provide. So we certainly hope it doesn't have to go up. We're close to being at the stage where you might be hearing from the Comptroller General again. The administrator of SBA will be hearing from the Comptroller General again. Our General Counsel will be reaching out to the General Counsel at SBA. It is an extreme situation.
So the agency is not collecting demographic data that we have requested, and that was the intent and essence of the Senate when we passed the legislation. It's clearly stated. And so how difficult does that make your job and our job in determining whether or not we are making sure that the loans are going to deserving businesses, and particularly minority and businesses in underserved communities?
This is an issue we have dealt with with numerous programs, including now with PPP as far as demographic data. And SBA takes a certain view toward the authority to collect data on race and ethnicity. And we've been dealing with that. So the workaround, I think, becomes for SBA and for us is to geocode where we're not saying who are the borrowers, are they minority-owned small businesses, but at least what communities are they operating in? And that becomes the best we can do with that situation.
Chairwoman, with your indulgence, I just need to ask one more question, and if you consider that necessary, please allot the same amount of time to the minority. There are 4,226 loans that went to businesses with over 500 employees. In your work, have you been able to examine whether SBA has confirmed that these businesses employed the number of employees stated in their application?
We are still at the stage, and we've been waiting for a meeting that's now scheduled for next week, just dealing with what we consider extreme data reliability issues, which affects our ability to do work that's associated with evaluating that Mike Ware was talking about, data analytics. It's affecting our ability to evaluate who the programs are serving. And we are trying to move forward on that, but we aren't at that stage yet. And part of that is the extended delays we get in dealing with SBA.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentle lady's time has expired, and the gentle lady yields back. Now the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Burchett, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Lady, and I appreciate the panel. I guess my first question would be what has been the economic impact of this? And I'll open that up to anybody who'd care to answer that, positive or negative, overall.
Sorry, Bill, you gonna talk?
Right, go ahead.
Okay, by economic impact, I think you're talking about the economic impact of the fraud.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
of both sides of it. I'd like to hear both sides of it.
Oh, there is absolutely no doubt that this program, both programs, reached out to people who were definitely in need, and we know that for certain. But we also know for certain that there is no assurance that all that money went to the small businesses it was intended to go to, and this is a fact. I do believe that there's a balance that could be struck in order to mitigate much of the risk of fraud and to shore up vulnerabilities that that both of us have identified for SBA. But on the one side, I'm telling you that SBA's employees have worked long and hard to get this money into the hands of people who badly needed it. Fraudsters do what fraudsters do. We have identified many of the schemes. We've worked with the agency to mitigate much of that risk. So I know that there is a large part, there is no doubt that there is a large part that have gone to ineligible and fraudulent recipients.
Since we have identified those, are we going to be, do you think it's in place? I'm sorry to interrupt you, but, and I like what you said about fraudsters are going to fraud. I think that's a pretty accurate, every time you do something, some new plan or some horrible tragedy occurs in our country, these dirtbags get out and take advantage of the situation. But is something in place to go after these people? And do you feel like we will go after them, or are we just going to say, we'll let it go?
No. So, like the Department of Justice what is it called, the press conference that we had just a few weeks ago. We had it to signify the 50th arrest made of these fraudsters. There are hundreds of investigations already in process by my office. The FBI at that press conference stated that they had over 500 investigations initiated. And if you know how fraud works and fraud investigations work, that normally doesn't take place until 12 to 18 months after these loans have gone out. The fact that we have moved so very quickly to catch people has been pretty remarkable, and a great deal has to do with the Department of Justice and their partnership with us and other law enforcement entities. But we're on this, and we're going to keep going.
Good. I appreciate that. What I'm afraid is that we move on to the next calamity in our country and we forget about the working folks who didn't get the money that should have, because again, is my favorite term, these dirt bags got the money and they shouldn't have. And we've got hardworking business folks, especially our smaller business in our rural and our inner city areas, will not receive that funding. And thank you for your answer, sir. I know you were wanting to say something too as well, please.
I will pull this up from the fraud issue, but just saying, who are the intended beneficiaries of this program, and how is it serving these small businesses in the communities they operate in, kind of like over time? It was clear that PPP is trying to both keep businesses in business and to allow businesses to keep payroll, where EIDL is a little bit more of a focus on keeping businesses sustainable. So there's slightly different approaches. They serve slightly different issues. But let me take PPP. We have serious concerns about data reliability having to do with jobs reported. But nonetheless, it's clear that PPP has spent a large amount of resources to support a large number of small businesses that employ a lot of people. And so it has been a lifeline. So we can observe that. What also became clear is that where originally it was an 8-week period, before forgiveness, that it was recognized that the pandemic would continue for a longer period of time, and Congress, made legislative changes to expand that period. What we don't know yet in terms of economic impact is basically that to what degree it has helped various segments of the economy. And it's a very difficult question to answer, and it might not be possible until we've gotten through much, if not all, of loan forgiveness. But there's a lot of questions as far as over the long haul, where there's still uncertainties about what will happen with the pandemic. There's still a lot of questions of what the economic impact ultimately will be. But it has certainly been a lifeline for, a very large number of small businesses.
As in my district. Chair Lady, I've gone over, but if you could issue my distaste, the fact that this is such an important issue and we have so many, I have to go to another committee and that we're marking up bills, but if you could tell them to prioritize these things, both parties do it. This should be prioritized. We should not be scheduling other meetings. We go hours during the day where nothing is going on, nothing, absolutely nothing, and they stack these dadgum committees on top of each other, and it's a disservice to you as a chair lady and disrespectful to you, and it's disrespectful to the dadgum taxpayers. And I'm going to talk to my leadership, and I would hope that you would do the same, because this is a very important issue, and I apologize that I have to go to another committee, but I'm very passionate about this issue. So thank you, ma'am, and you're always your courtesy to me and friendship.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. And the gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman yields back. And now the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Evans, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. Mr. Shear, SBA has relying on heavy contractors to process idle applications. What information has SBA provided to you on the contractual responsibility of contractors and subcontractors, and why such important information for GAO works?
This is one of the areas. We had a meeting with SBA last Wednesday, so just 8 days ago, where there at least was a meeting to talk about what we're requesting from the agency. So that was a step forward, but there was no timeline put on providing material. And in both of these programs, but you asked with respect to EIDL, there's heavy reliance on contractors. So we just asked for the contracts themselves. And that will lead to questions about what the contractors are doing, but it will get us started. And in terms of information that should be readily available, we're still waiting for a response. And as I said to Chairwoman Velazquez, we're taking actions to push this forward, just like we did with PPP and access to PPP data. But we are still seeking information from SBA on the contracts and what the contractors are doing.
Do you get any real sense of cooperation or not?
No, the cooperation has been poor, and I don't like stating this, but we haven't had good cooperation in conducting this work. There was some improvement when the agency then decided that they would provide us loan-level PPP data, but it's not the usual cooperation that we have received from SBA, for that matter, other agencies, with respect to both of these programs.
Mr. Ware, it is my understanding that SBA did not put in internal controls in place for PPP and EIDL on the front end of loans because of the speed in which CARES Act when they needed to get the small business. Many businesses in my district needed the money right away to stay afloat with non-essential closed. Mr. Ware, if Congress authorized additional, and the chairwoman of OVAL sort of asked you this, authorized additional funding, can you be specific what you recommend Congress take to ensure internal controls are placed at the beginning of the approval process of the new loans?
Right. So thanks for the question. Recommend that Congress put in place just the need to have the type of controls that at the very least, if an application falls into the high risk, where we know there is fraud buckets, where we know there's rampant fraud buckets, it requires an automatic second look to verify. So the lower end of the guardrails needs to come up, particularly on those that fall in the high risk areas. That's in those that have multiple loans in the same type of NAICS code categories from the same IP addresses. Those that have random email generator accounts. Those where the bank accounts are changed after the approval process is over. Those that are in the name of, for example, like prominent politicians, prominent business leaders that we would all know their names, and other clearly ineligible entities, and the type of controls that capture the ineligible entities. If the date does not meet this, or if the TIN does not meet this date, it is automatically declined. Those upfront controls are necessary.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yield back to bounds.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman yields back. And now the gentle lady from Minnesota, Ms. Craig, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman Chu, and good morning, everyone. Chairwoman and Ranking Member Spano, I'm so grateful we're having this hearing today. This issue is incredibly important to me, the issue of fraud and improper payments and government waste. Since the beginning of the COVID pandemic, I've worked hard, I know all of us have, to make sure that we're providing the businesses in our community the absolute best of resources, and especially to those hard-hit small businesses through the PPP program. You know, these fraudulent activities that have now been incredibly well documented, it steals resources from taxpayers, and it steals resources from the small businesses who still need that help. Improper payments are exactly why I introduced the Payment Integrity Information Act, which I'm proud that President Trump signed this into law earlier this year. It strengthens protections against improper payments in federal programs. So currently, there are a number of resources and tools available out there in the market, developed to detect exactly the kind of fraudulent activity that seems to have gotten through the SBA. In fact, a division of Thomson Reuters, located right in my congressional district, has that kind of technology and system. So in light of this, Mr. Ware, I have a first question for you. Do you feel at this stage that SBA has the necessary tools and resources and funding and oversight to be able to accelerate your efforts to prevent fraud and waste? And if not, what specifically do you need from our subcommittee in the U.S. Congress to put you in a better position to manage your activity in this agency?
Hey, thank you. I'm being told that I got a call from the House that said that my camera is coming and going. I don't know why I'm looking at myself. So I don't know what's going on, so I apologize. So when you ask about the resources, are you asking about SBA OIG or are you asking about SBA proper?
I'm asking more generally, do you and the agency have what you need to be able to do better? Because obviously there's technology out there that can help you detect and improve the accountability here. And I'm asking, is there an active effort to make sure that that happens? Because sadly, this pandemic is not going away anytime soon. And I suspect unless we're able to effectively suppress this virus in a way that we clearly haven't been, we're going to have to continue to ask SBA to do some very difficult things that obviously we're not in a position to stop fraudulent activity at this moment.
We are extremely fortunate that maybe 2 years ago, Congress gave us additional money to stand up our data analytics capability. And we are very fortunate that that investment was made, because that group is doing excellent work in identifying fraud trends and in quickly reporting out on them to the agency. As far as the agency, well, and still speaking about my resources, right? We are coordinating with the PRAC and with other law enforcement entities to approach this in a more whole of government manner. As far as the agency, like I said earlier, they have taken some steps. I'll give you one of the steps in terms of their resources. Initially, in that first report that we issued, where we were talking about all these thousands of calls we were getting from the banks saying, hey guys, there's fraud here. We don't know what to do with this. We've stopped this. We've held this money. How do we get the money back to the government? This, that, and the other. We pulled everybody into a meeting, and initially, what I required was a secondary review that we were asking SBA to conduct to make sure, because sometimes there's reasons why things happen, and it could be an eligible loan. But they only had a couple of people assigned to doing that. They grew that to immediately 25 people to do that. And then I think it was 54. And now I believe that number is even higher. So they have put the bodies necessary to have these secondary reviews. We have not reviewed how that has gone on yet. This is what has been reported to us. But in terms of resources, I can't speak to what SBA has to do things. I just know that they have moved things around to address and to mitigate some of this fraud risk.
Thank you, Mr. Ware. It appears my time has expired, so I'll yield back to the chairwoman.
Thank you. The gentle lady's time has expired and she yields back. And now we actually have time for a second round of questions if anybody desires to do so. I believe the topic is so important that I would like to go a second round. And so I will start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Scheer, I wanted to ask about the loan forgiveness process. You described in your September report that SBA has not provided clear guidance to lenders on the PPP loan forgiveness process. And as a result, SBA may be using unreliable data to process loan forgiveness. And I would say that the description that you provide describes a situation that is at best fragmented. And that is the guidance comes on a rolling basis. There are not specific review requirements for lenders who are processing these applications, but as a result, what we have is a situation where SBA has announced it's received 96,000 forgiveness applications, but has yet to process and approve one single one. That is, I mean, there are lots of businesses that are hanging on the edges of their seats, wondering if they're going to get loan forgiveness. So what specific steps should SBA take now to improve the quality of this data? And what can be done to make sure that there is a loan forgiveness process that is functional?
There has to be clear guidance and responsibilities of who's responsible for what, and the role of SBA's oversight of that process. You have banks are interested in certain types of safe harbor. That has always been an issue. You have had reliance on borrower certifications. And again, we were very receptive to the fact that loans had to be gotten out very quickly. But immediately, our first report, we made a pretty broad recommendation that you needed certain controls in place, and there has to be some clarity for the participants in the program rather than this rolling guidance. So there has to be clearer processes and procedures that banks and borrowers can go on. And I say this especially with respect to the smallest businesses that might not have the most resources available for accounting and legal assistance. So there just has to be greater clarity. And we need, again, we wish they would look at us as an asset in terms of trying to improve the integrity of this program, and that they would let us look like they do at other programs in our experience at SBA, and actually be in a position to evaluate and to make recommendations for how those processes can be improved.
Thank you, Mr. Scheer. Now I'd like to ask about the first phase of PPP being dominated by large borrowers and even some publicly traded companies. SBA had issued guidance to emphasize the economic necessity requirements, but then this came after many larger companies, even publicly traded companies, had already been approved. So first, how many publicly traded companies returned the money? And what is the dollar amount that this represents? And how would you suggest SBA prevent large companies from accessing a program designed for America's smallest companies?
If that question is for me, I don't have the exact figures. I definitely could get back to you within a very short period of time on the exact figures, but in terms of what happened there was how it was initially set up in terms of the 500 employees in a single place, and that allowed some of these larger companies to get in within the confines of the law. Now, so if you understand, like the NAICS code that they use, I believe it's 72. You're considered small if the businesses had fewer than 500 employees in one location. So that happened. So if there's a shoring up of that to ensure, and I believe there was in the amended or the next act that came out, but that's how they can ensure that these companies don't get it. And like I said, I'll get back to you with the exact amount of companies and the exact amount of dollars.
My time has expired, but yes, I'm very, very interested in that information. I think so many others would be as well. So please come back with that information. I yield back, and now the ranking member from Florida, Mr. Spano, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. What is the percentage of fraudulent loans approved in proportion to the 5.2 million loans approved?
I'll at least start with that.
Yeah.
We don't know. Just realize that we make a very big distinction between fraud risk and the management of fraud risk. And a lot of things we've talked about in this hearing have been about data analytics and other actions to look at fraud risk management. And so we look at that. We're not a law enforcement agency. But one of the things that we emphasize is, how do you prevent this? How do you set up the fraud risk framework along the lines that we have actually had a report now since 2015 spelling it out that's widely used by agencies? How do you set it up? Because the cost of setting up prevention right out of the starting gate, or even now when you're talking about what happens as we proceed with loan forgiveness and other aspects of the program, prevention tends to be the most efficient thing to do.
I get that, and I apologize for interjecting. I only have 5 minutes.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay.
But here, from the very beginning, what has been articulated as the balance that has to be struck between, in this particular situation, getting money out quickly and preventing against fraud. They're both important. We obviously experienced personally how important that was when we were getting, in our congressional offices, dozens and dozens of calls from small businesses owners every day that said, "What in the world are you doing? I've got to know what's going on. I don't know whether to let my staff go. So there was this inexorable push to the SBA to get this stuff done quickly, okay? So, and last thing I want is fraud. Don't want fraud. But when we acknowledge that there are two competing interests in this scenario, to get it out quickly and prevent fraud, it seems to me that an important question we should ask, and an answer that we should have, if both are important, is how many loans were fraudulent and how much of the over 525 billion loans was extended was fraudulent. That will help us determine how much, if any, additional measures should be taken to prevent fraud in the future. Does that make sense?
Yes. Let me try to be
Okay.
brief on this. It'll be a long time until we know how much fraud there was in the program, and you can think of the education of Department of Justice and other law enforcement. But part of our emphasis has been, we very much recognize that loans, there was a push to get loans out, but with the passage of time, it becomes much more troubling when the fraud framework is not in place to try to mitigate the risk of fraud existing, in the program and being practiced, and even more generally, improper payments occurring because of the lack of oversight at some point in time. And we think that time has come, and that's what we're looking for, is what has SBA put in place? So that's where our emphasis has been.
Understood. What do you, if you know, what's the statute of limitations for prosecution of fraud under the CARES Act? And well, I'll let you answer that first.
No, well, if you want to make a question for the record, I don't know it. Maybe Mike Ware does, but I don't know. But if you make a question for the record, I'd be glad to respond.
All right, Mr. Ware, can you answer that question?
Right. The CARES Act didn't specify a particular amount of time in terms of it. Normally, we're looking at 7 to 10 years that we're dealing with on these fraud investigations. And these loans are going to perform in the portfolio for decades. So, I mean, there will be a time to go back and deal with this. But if I may, I don't know if we still have time for me to.
Yeah, I have 30 seconds.
Okay, quickly. So the issue with this is that in terms of the fraud framework that needs to be in place, we know for a fact that there is fraud, mainly because of the thousands of calls in a hotline, particularly having to do with identity theft, where people are finding out for the very first time that their identities were stolen when they hear from SBA that their loan payments are going to be deferred, and they're like, "What loan payments? I've never had a loan from SBA. This is routine. We're getting this dozens every single day. And we're hearing some heartbreaking stories out there, and all these things fall into the same buckets where we're talking about this fraud environment."
Thank you, Mr. Ware. And I know my time is up. I would say it seems to me if the CARES Act didn't specify what the appropriate statute of limitations is, that's something that we should follow up on. I think that would give us the opportunity to be able to plan long-term for what the window of time would be in which we need to go back after these folks. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired, and the gentleman yields back. And now our chairwoman from New York, Ms. Velasquez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ware, I would like to ask the same question that I asked Mr. Scheer, but because of technical difficulties, I was unable to ask the same question to you. And it's regarding the GAO September report that shows that 4,226 loans went to businesses with over 500 employees. So in your work, have you been able to examine whether or not SBA has confirmed that these businesses employ the number of employees stated in their application?
Oh, if we have confirmed this?
Yes.
Yes, our work has confirmed that some of that did take place. The thing is, I don't have the exact figures in front of me. I definitely could get you that though. And I already see that looking at the screen that the request for that information already popped up.
So several loans that were granted to companies with over 500 employees, notwithstanding the rules that permitted exemption for the lodging and food industry. Does your office plan to examine how these companies were eligible to receive these loans?
Certainly. I believe that that's covered in our supplemental overview plan that we have publicly. And we'll be definitely looking into that and into eligibility. As a matter of fact, some of that will be reported publicly later in this month.
Okay. And Mr. Ware, in SBA's official response to your report, Administrator Carranza stated that, and I quote, "Loan decisions are ultimately made by people, namely loan officers. During your investigation or in the time since, have you reviewed whether there are adequate training protocols in place for SBA loan officers?"
Initially, no. Now, yes.
Okay. Because money was provided, funding was provided to the agency to execute and implement the PPP and EIDL program. Mr. Scheer, in GAO's report in September, you stated that the Department of Justice has publicly announced charges in over 50 fraud-related cases related to the PPP. These cases were referred to the DOJ by SBA, but the agency has yet to implement additional internal controls to mitigate risks. Can you expound on the risk SBA is incurring by not implementing internal controls for PPP? And what is your assessment as to why they, to this point, after we enacted the first tranche of money, they have not been able to put in place a control mechanism?
With the lack of information provided to us, we presume that controls are not in place. And we would hope that, I don't want to speak for the Inspector General, but I would hope that they could view us in a more constructive way in terms of helping to identify how you can create a better control environment for this. So with the passage of time, again, right out of the gate, we thought that something very serious was needed with the limited upfront controls, and we just don't see it yet. We see references on pages 8 and 9 of my written statement as far as how they're going to use contractors, but we don't even have contracts now. And we, as auditors, we ask the question, what is the agency trying to hide? And there's just too many questions that go unanswered.
Well, we just need to be on record, basically pointing out the attitude of this administration. You could go out there and yes, we do not deny that the agency must do everything they can to put money into the hands of deserving businesses, but not at the expense of compromising the fact that they have to take every control or put in place every mechanism to make sure that we avoid mismanagement, fraud, and abuse. And it is not happening. Chairwoman, thank you. I yield back.
Chairwoman, you're muted.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. And now the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Evans, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairperson. My issues to Mr. Shears again. Many lenders in my home city of Philadelphia have expressed frustration with the piecemeal release of PPP rules. Despite SBA issuing rules for PPP forgiveness, there is still much confusion about the lender's role in the process. SBA is supposed to send the forgiveness amount to lenders no later than 90 days from receipt of the lender's decision on loan forgiveness. That means for any application submitted on August the 10th, the first day SBA started accepting them, SBA has little more than over a month to send the funds to the lender. This is especially concerning because lenders such as CDFIs are already operating at a tight margin. Mr. Sears, what do you believe SBA will be able to do to meet this deadline? And if not able to meet the 90-day deadline for distribution of forgiven funds, will this dissuade lenders from participating in the PPP future?
I'll first start with saying that SBA might actually meet those deadlines. Our concern in meeting those deadlines is that we're looking for some type of control environment under which the forgiveness process will proceed. But so SBA could meet the deadlines. It's the question of whether it will protect the integrity of the program in how they go about it. So Now, if they don't meet those deadlines, then you are creating more uncertainty for the lenders. And the lenders have certainly, we have spent a lot of time talking to lenders and their trade groups, and the concerns with the rolling guidance, I'll call it, and just changes in the program, and the whole question of how much lenders will be held harmless based on certifications by borrowers. It's just like the situation keeps changing. So we are very cognizant of the strain that this has put on lenders. And you could say they're being compensated for it, but in a sense, they're being compensated for something that it wasn't clear when they got involved with this, what their responsibilities would be. So I hope that's responsive to your question.
Yes. Madam Chair, I thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. And now I would like to make a closing statement. I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us both virtually and in person to share their important testimony today. The oversight work of the OIG and GAO is vital to ensuring that we root out instances of fraud and abuse and spend America's tax dollars wisely, especially since our small businesses need so much help. Your work helps inform the subcommittee on existing problems within SBA's COVID-19 programs and gives us insight into these issues as they unfold in real time. It is my hope that considering what we learned today, that the SBA will fully cooperate with GAO and the OIG to improve these programs for our nation's small businesses. Our witnesses today showed that with proper input and cooperation, it can be done. I look forward to continuing our oversight efforts with all of you as partners. I ask unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days to submit statements and supporting materials for the record. Without objection, so ordered. And if there's no further business before the committee, we are adjourned.
Thank you very much.